All right, let's talk about MDM migrations. So I'm Kevin Cox. I'm on the client platform engineering team at DoorDash. I'm easy to find on the MacAdmin Slack. If you want to connect anywhere else to talk about maybe photography or baseball, you can find me at kevinmcox.com/links. So changing MDMs is disruptive. It requires user interaction and work disruption for most companies utilizing commercial MDM providers. So in my opinion, that potential for disruption causes most companies to avoid changing MDMs, even if they'd want to. So minimizing that disruption has to be the primary goal of any MDM migration. So historically, re-enrollment is not intuitive for the end user. The DEP nag was easily missed, users could ignore it indefinitely, and there was no native ability to force re-enrollment. In macOS 13 Ventura and older, the built-in dialogues are not effective for timely re-enrollments. So 5 years ago, Eric Gomez looked to help solve that problem by publishing UMAD. It can handle automated device enrollment and manual enrollment scenarios. It had logic built in to check for MDM enrollment and then trigger the dialogue if needed. Other companies have shared examples of using other tools like Swift Dialog to build their own UI for the process. And we were fully prepared to go down that road as well until WWDC 2023 when macOS 14 Sonoma was announced. So in macOS 14 Sonoma, automated device enrollment can be enforced after Setup Assistant. So that caught my attention right away. Of everything announced last year at WWDC, this was what stood out to me as being the most immediately impactful for us. So our team immediately saw the potential for this new feature to drive our migration experience. So we tested it extensively during the beta cycle, open cases with Apple, and made sure it was working how we wanted it to before release. And then by the time 14.0 released in September of last year, we were confident we could use it to be the user-facing part of our migration. So I personally began referring to this feature as retroactive automated device management, or automated device enrollment. I'm not sure anyone else ever did. But as soon as Sonoma came out, I published a blog and tried to get more attention to it. So I'm sure most of you all are familiar with this already, but I'm going to walk through it really quick. So a full screen dialog replaces that traditional DEP nag and notification center and cannot be missed or ignored by end users. Users can defer it for up to 8 hours by clicking Not Now. During that deferral time window, they can resume it at any time by going to System Settings. After 8 hours, that full screen dialog comes back with no ability to defer. You can only go through enrollment. In macOS 14, users still have to be local admins. We require Okta authentication to go through enrollment. The enrollment profile is installed, and then just like that, they're done. They can exit and go back to the desktop. So while this dialog doesn't have any like flashy company branding or logos, being native to macOS meant we didn't have to build, test, and deploy some custom UI for this process. But it doesn't come without trade-offs. So one question we had was, could we allow users to a choice on when to migrate? Some MDM vendors provide a tool to facilitate migration, but many of those require putting an API key on every device, and that wasn't acceptable to us. We built a proof of concept to use our CI/CD system as an intermediary for that key, but ultimately decided not to use it. And because we decided trying to mix a custom UI with the built-in UI from Apple and solving that security concern just wasn't worth the effort. So the new dialog also has limitations. It must be purposefully launched in an MDM migration scenario. Simply unenrolling a Mac or changing the MDM assignment in ABM isn't enough to trigger it. If a user defers, the dialog isn't seen again until that 8-hour timer expires, and at that point they're stuck. They've got to complete the enrollment. The new dialog's only in Sonoma, so we had to get everybody upgraded first. And the devices must be an Apple Business Manager for our purposes. So to work around those limitations, we had to build the logic to craft our ideal user experience. So once we decided we could leverage this new built-in experience in macOS, we had to figure out the best way to do it. So I can't stress enough how important communication was prior to and during the migration. We started by coordinating with internal communications. We got a first mention out there during a company all-hands a month prior. A company-wide email went out 2 weeks before. Company-wide Slack post the week we started. We had a detailed FAQ that we updated continuously as we got new questions we hadn't thought of before. Detailed screenshots of what all these dialogues would look like when the user went through the process. And we had a dedicated Slack channel where we monitored for questions and to provide support with help from the service desk. And we had our IT bot on Slack send direct messages to communicate scheduling, provide instructions, confirm completion, remind users, all on an individual basis. That included addressing them by their name, specifying the serial numbers in question. They weren't just generic blasted at everybody. So we use Nudge. So the bulk of the fleet was already on Sonoma long before we started the migration. But for those that slipped through the cracks, we notified them via Slack. And if they hadn't complied, after about a week, their manager started getting notified as well that they needed to upgrade. We notified users the day before they were scheduled to migrate. We added them to this dedicated channel, gave them the chance to ask questions, request to migrate earlier or later. We reminded them an hour before. We let them know it was about to start. We thanked them once they were done, and we kicked them out of the channel so they could go back to work. So we tried to keep the messages brief and to the point. We used a bunch of emoji. We tried to keep the experience friendly overall. That's just one example. So natively, macOS only displays this new dialog a single time before the deadline, but we knew that wasn't enough for us. We wanted to provide users with an escalation of alerts and a sense of urgency as they approached that deadline. So we decided we'd trigger the dialog every hour for the first 4 hours, every 30 minutes for those next 2 hours, and then every 15 minutes for the last 2 hours of that 8-hour deferral. But of course, none of those repetitive dialogues would ever be seen for users who just completed the process the first time we asked them to do it. So on device, all we needed to deploy was a single launch daemon and a Python script. We decided to have this launch daemon executed every 5 minutes. And we had Monkey deliver these via package well before we started, and then Monkey made sure they remained installed, the launch daemon remained loaded. So this single Python script contained all the logic we needed to automate the on-device experience for the users. It had basic checks like, is a device enrolled? Is the user logged in? Is the screen locked? Have we prompted them recently already? We used Apple's DEP NAG plist to calculate that enrollment deadline and then to schedule like our prompt timing. And then the script ran the familiar sudo profiles renew type enrollment command as the user to trigger that dialog when it needed to be. And then we logged it all to a single file. So if a user ran into trouble, there was one thing they could grab and give to us, and we could see maybe what happened. So here's a flow chart for that on-device logic of that Python script. You can see it does those basic checks, decides does it need to trigger the dialog, and then it logs any action it took. So for planning automation, we knew it needed to run unattended in our CI/CD system using the vendor APIs. We had over 11,000 Macs in our old MDM, but we only ended up migrating 8,200 of those just because of ones that cycled through the warehouse during the process. So to deal with those in there, we divided them up into 100 random groups, and that allowed us to control how many computers migrated per day, and we could scale the count up or down as needed depending on the support load. And it also avoided trying to migrate entire departments or teams all at the same time. So when the new MDM was ready, we changed all the assignments in Apple Business Manager, and that meant any of those devices, brand new devices or recycled devices coming through the warehouse, they just went to the new MDM, and those users didn't have to deal with migrating. So that's where we saw that discrepancy of the 11,000 to the 8,200. And then we found about 25 devices that weren't in ABM, and we just exempted them from the automation, and those users got new computers because that was the easiest course of action there. And of course, we did lots of testing. So here's a look at our automation processes. Upgrade ran daily. It looked for all devices in the old MDM. If they were already on Sonoma or they hadn't been active recently, they were skipped. Otherwise, we added them to a list, notified the users via Slack, put them in a dedicated channel for upgrading macOS. And then, like I mentioned, if they didn't comply, after a week, their managers started getting messages too. Preparation ran at T-minus 20 hours. It gathered the devices from those selected groups for the next day, made sure they were on Sonoma, made sure they had been active recently, notified the users, put them in the channel. We reminded users at T-minus 1 hour. It looked at that list of prepared devices, made sure they hadn't left the channel, put them back if they had, reminded them. And then when we started the process, we had that list of prep devices for the day, made sure, again, the user hasn't left the channel, they're still there. We notified them. We sent the unenroll command via API to the old MDM, and we logged the timestamp we did that. And then completion ran hourly. It looked for devices that had been unenrolled but had not shown up in the new MDM yet, checked to see if they had. When it found one, it logged the timestamp so then we could see how long devices had remained unenrolled, sent them a message to thank them for doing their part, and boot them out of the channel. And then the follow-up was those users, those devices in limbo, the users who got unenrolled but hadn't shown up in the new MDM yet. We put them back in the channel again if they left, sent them a note, let them know they needed to complete the process. So what results did we see? So 100% of active in-use devices have been migrated. We've got 99% of total devices that we expected to migrate have been. We've got some users on leave. We've got users who got new Macs and still haven't shipped back their old one. It's sitting in their closet. Those pretty much make up that last 1%. We had 93% of devices migrated by the end of the third week. We processed 129 manually, and these were mostly users who got put in the channel and said, I've got a big meeting tomorrow, can I just do this today? And we said, yeah, sure, we'll do it right now. And we manually unenrolled them and let them go through the process. We've got a dozen Macs still that were unenrolled but never completed the migration. But all these users' Okta accounts are locked, so they can't do anything when they do come back. And out of all of this, we only had one mad user. So here we can see the progress during those first 3 weeks that got us to that 93%. Week 2 was the big one. We went from 1,000 devices to over 6,000 in 4 days. This graph of the timeline through last week is much less interesting. As you can see, this project had a really long tail on it as we just trickled in these remaining few. So one of the key metrics we needed to track during this was the amount of time that devices remained in that unmanaged state. So the automation recorded the time when we sent the unenrollment command, and then it queried the new MDM to find out when they got enrolled so we could do the calculations. So our record enrollment clocked in at 35 seconds from unenrollment to re-enrollment. And this was not someone in IT. This was a random user who was ready for the process when it happened, clicked through the dialogues, 35 seconds later, they were in the new MDM. Our slowest enrollment was 171 days. This was a user who was out on medical leave, so we knew where they were and why they hadn't re-enrolled. But as soon as they came back, the launch daemon kicked in, the script ran, they got enrolled, no problem. And in the end, we averaged 24 hours of unenrolled time. But when you take into account time zones for a global fleet and the fact that we were only recording when we queued up the unenrollment command with the old MDM, we weren't actually checking when the device acknowledged it, we were happy with this. So here's that risk window. So 28% of devices were re-enrolled within 5 minutes. Over 50% were re-enrolled within 15, and 89% were re-enrolled at that 24-hour mark. So those 10% of devices that took longer than 24 hours tended to take a really long time, like our 171-day user, so that really pushed our average down. So I wasn't kidding when I said we only had one angry user. So for the most part, users just went through the process quietly without the need of any help, or they had positive things to say. And when we did get that positive feedback, we made an effort to recognize it and amplify it. For example, pinning it in the dedicated Slack channel that everyone was in. And it was great to see the emoji reactions with +1s and stuff pile up. Because, of course, it made us feel good when people left that public feedback in a channel. But then it also, I think, helped other users slow down and read before stressing out when they saw coworkers talking about like how fast and simple the process was. So what are some lessons learned that hopefully will help anyone else looking to migrate? What worked well was knowing the what, why, when, prepared leadership to intercede in case of problems, which thankfully for us was not needed. Having frontline IT support in the loop allowed them to handle the routine aspects, freeing the CPE team to focus on the overall process. And this included our executive support lead, who went above and beyond, answering questions all hours of the night. No one asked him to, he just did it. Having allies outside of IT sharing their experience went a long way to setting the tone, because when you see I'm scheduled to do this and then you look and see everyone talking about how easy it was, it just makes everyone relax. So the vast majority of users were not surprised. They had seen the notices, they had read the documentation, but those who had missed it were directed to it by these users who had read it. So having that proactive communication, I think, helped people feel confident that they knew the answers. They knew where to point people, and they didn't have to wait for IT to give them the answer. And that forced schedule, while some people were skeptical about doing it that way, it really helped keep things on track in the long run. So it didn't work. So letting users self-manage their migration. So iPhones and iPads require a wipe to move MDMs. So we took a different approach for the users with those devices. We provided the instructions, put them in a dedicated Slack channel, and then gave them a deadline and said, please have this done by this date. If you need help, we're here for you. Well, only 26% of those users completed the process by that deadline, and only 87% had completed it by the time the contract with our old MDM expired. And this was at least 3 months since we first let them know about it. So something else that didn't work really well was trying to make everyone happy. Our RFP took significantly longer than planned because we tried to let too many other teams give feedback and weigh in. And while they had valuable input and we got some good ideas and some good things to consider, we should have set clearer expectations up front of what we were looking for and what they might be able to influence. So what we could have done better is we focused a lot on communicating only via Slack, because that's pretty much the majority of where users get their stuff. Most people at DoorDash don't check their email. But we did hear from some employees who said, I get too many notifications in Slack. If you would have emailed me, I would have seen it. And so we should have tried harder to meet users where they are instead of just assuming we knew the best way to contact them. And we should have started sooner, especially on the technical components. Since renewing our existing MDM was a very real possibility, they were in the RFP, and that was a real possibility of something we could do, we kind of put off starting the technical stuff longer than we should have. And in hindsight, we should have started working on that right away, because even if we stayed with the original vendor, we could have learned some stuff along the way, and it would have been worthwhile. And we also migrated hundreds of Windows devices, but that's enough for a different conference. Anybody got any questions? Alan.
What was the time period before or between knowing that you wanted the new vendor, like you'd already gone through the evaluation period, you'd done all the pros and cons, and then seeing that announcement? Oh, sorry. Microphone. Thanks. What was the time period between when you had finally decided on the new vendor? You'd already done all the evaluation and pros and cons, and you're like, we want to migrate to this. And then seeing that presentation at WWDC 2023.
So we had started talking about a migration in November 2022. And it kind of took a while for the RFP to ramp up and get official. I mean, we were going to kind of wing it, and then it was like, no, we're going to do this legit. Here's a project manager and all that kind of stuff. We had started the RFP, but had not finished it. We had not selected a vendor when WWDC happened. We didn't select the vendor until September, I think, and then started the migration like in November. So
So you knew you wanted to move. You just hadn't finalized that this is this specific vendor.
I mean, we were pretty sure we wanted to move, but we included the existing vendor in the RFP. Like, we wanted to give them a chance to see what they would say or how they would come back to us. So they were in the mix, but we knew something had to give somewhere.
Cool.
Okay. Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks, Joe.
That was awesome.